All right, thank you. So my name is Jacob, and Julie is also here,
Yeah.
I believe. Yep. And we're going to be talking about propaganda games today. Bit about propaganda in general to begin with, show you some examples. And then we'll look at it in terms of games and gamification before moving on to the specific paper that we posted. Yeah, so we'll just go ahead. There we go. So just a definition to begin with. What is propaganda? It is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. We also actually found out that there was a word for like a crew that the Pope appointed that were supposed to go around and spread the holy words or something. But this is what we're talking about today. So yeah, we'll start with a few examples from of propaganda throughout history. This is the Behistun inscription. It is from around 515 BC, so it's about 2,500 years old. It's located in Iran, and these inscriptions here actually contain multiple different languages. It was authored by Darius the Great. It was, and it details his rise to the Persian throne. And so this is considered by many historians to be, or maybe the first example of propaganda, and there are a few reasons for that. The inscription begins with a brief autobiography of King Darius's rise and his ancestry and lineage. And then it moves on to detailing the events of King Darius fighting 19 battles to put down multiple rebellions throughout the Persian Empire. And then one of the reasons it's considered to be propaganda is because it was authored by him, and it states in detail that the rebellions were orchestrated by several imposters and co-conspirators in various cities throughout the empire, each of whom had falsely proclaimed or claimed to be proclaimed the kinghood at some point before during these battles. So that's like a very early first example. You can see King Darius right here and his followers, subjects, and yeah, like I said, the texts. And the text here actually contributed to translating various script languages. So move on. This is a woodcut from around 1545. It was commissioned by Martin Luther, and it's usually referred to as the pappspotbilder, which essentially is making fun of the Pope. And the text right here, it says, "Don't frighten us, Pope, with your ban, and don't be such a furious man. Otherwise, we shall turn around and show you our ears," which they are doing in this illustration right here with the Pope and his subjects. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to look at a couple of posters from World War I and World War II. And I think you all have seen this poster before. It's called Uncle Sam and was designed by James Montgomery Flagg in 1917 during World War I. And this poster made the war a personal crusade, denoting that the US doesn't want someone else to fight it, it wants you to fight it. So this is maybe the most famous recruitment poster in American history. And just a small fun fact, Uncle Sam is usually associated with the businessman Samuel Wilson. He supplied the army with barrels of beef during the War of 1812. And those barrels were stamped US to indicate government property. And that identification is said to have led to the widespread use of the nickname Uncle Sam for the United States. And a resolution passed by Congress in 1961 recognized Wilson as the namesake of the national symbol. So that's why it's called Uncle Sam. And we are going to look at a poster from World War II. If you go to the next slide, this is an Italian poster by Gino Boccasil. I don't know if I say it right, but I think it's from 1942. It was produced for the Italian armed forces, depicting a gigantic Japanese samurai sinking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. And I think you know what happened at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese forces suddenly attacked the US naval base, which happened 7th of December 1941. And this also is reflecting the intent of the Axis powers with respect to the Allied forces in general, because the Axis powers were the alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. So this poster plays on traditional values and the history of Japan with the use of the samurai. So what you can see in the poster are the flags of the Axis powers, Germany and Japan behind the samurai, along with the Italian naval ensign flag. And you can also see some ships in both foreground and in a distance in the background between his legs that are sinking. So, next slide. This is a film called Under the Sun. And you can say that it's a documentary about the making of a documentary. And it was directed by the Russian Vitaly Mansky. The film follows a year in the life of a family in Pyeongchang in North Korea, as their daughter Sin-mi prepares to join the Korean Children's Union on the day of the Shining Star, which is Kim Jong-il's birthday. And a fun fact about the making of this film is that they let the camera still shoot in between the takes. And in the beginning, North Korea permitted only the director, the cinematographer, and a sound assistant to visit the country, and no one else. And the filmmakers were required to submit their memory cards every day, so that the North Korean censors deleted any scene they didn't want to use. And then, without explanation, North Korean authorities suddenly canceled the whole project before the shooting was even complete. And what they didn't know was that the crew was backing up all the footage on a second set of cards, so they could retain the moments the authorities thought were erased. So Mansky felt free to use the existing footage for a film about the country's unbeautifulness and presented a society in which nothing is natural. The film also used ordinary North Koreans to play the fictional roles, and that's not really a documentary. So the parents, for example, are both shown to labor in exemplary factories where in fact they don't really work. In reality, the dad is a print journalist, which may mean that his job is at the same propaganda agency that accompanied the film. So this is a good example of a propaganda film with a twist. And Jacob has actually seen it, so do you have anything to add, or do you recommend the film?
Yeah, I really recommend it for those who haven't seen it. Has anyone here seen it? Would like to pitch in with some thoughts?
You can use the yes or no button if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so only...
We'll wait for that.
Yeah, only Vegard has seen it, I think.
Okay. Yeah, would you like to share some thoughts on it, Vegard? Or?
It was creepy. That's really the only thing.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting piece of propaganda in that sense, I think, because you are essentially viewing propaganda, but then you are also viewing all of the staging that happens in between takes. Like for instance, we often see these war veterans with a bunch of medals in North Korean ceremonies, and that's one of the things that happens in the movie. They're at a ceremony where a veteran is supposed to speak for the children, and you can actually see that it was just a random guy they pulled off the street and put him in a uniform and put him in a bunch of medals. So he wasn't really a war veteran at all. And like the aspects that Julie mentioned, that they're just like the parents of the girl we are following. It's just they're just there to play roles. They're not actually portrayed in a realistic way. But so you get to see this exemplary vision of North Korea that they want you to see, but also everything in between. So it's very interesting, and I really recommend it. So I guess we can move on.
Yeah. So we got a paper from Christopher last Thursday, and this is called The Chinese Social Credit System, a Model for Other Countries. And it's from 2019, so it's pretty new. And the paper argues that the Chinese models of new approaches to credit should be studied in the West. We could also post this paper on GitLab afterwards, because it's really interesting for those who want to read it. And this is just an example from financial ratings, where the scoring is based on factors such as financial credit records, behavioral trends in commercial transactions, available assets and personal information, behavior and preferences, and social relationships. Next slide. And the paper talks about two of the most extensive examples of regional pilot studies, which are from a couple of cities in the Shandong province. And in both of these pilots, each citizen started with 1,000 points each. They could then lose points for a variety of infringements, but they could also regain points by doing good actions. So here's some examples of negative or positive factors that can impact your score. Like negative factors can be jaywalking, running a red light, drunk driving, or having a child without the necessary administrative permission. And your rating can also go down by having friends with low scores or by speaking negatively of the government on social media. And some positive factors are then the opposite of the negative factors, obviously, like speaking positively of the government or having friends with high scores. But also caring for elderly family members will increase your score. So next.
I'd just like to add a quick point here about how the gamification is sort of visualized. In the application, you actually get, or there are multiple applications, but the one by Tencent and a few other companies, in that one you can actually, you will get notified if you have friends with low scores. So that, because that will affect your score, and then you can check that data and you will see which friends has which your friends have a lower score. That will impact yours, and app will kind of subtly nudge you into saying like, hey, maybe you should not hang out with these people or get rid of these friends, because that will give you a better time.
Yeah, and we will also look at an example in an episode of Black Mirror where this is actually happening. So in the resulting points of the study, the pilot studies, were then translated into a rating from A to D, which could influence the individual in a positive or negative way in their dealing with the local government. So how does the score affect your daily life? Like, for example, someone with a higher score would get professional access to government subsidies, taking the high-speed train and purchasing items considered to be luxurious like cars, while someone with a lower score could be restricted in applications for housing, social welfare, and business licenses. So this is just an example of like gamification in our daily lives that can lead to propaganda due to surveillance and violations of our privacy. But again, this paper also argued that it should be studied in the West as well as in China. So let's have a look at the Black Mirror episode. This is also discussed in that paper. And the TV series Black Mirror has an episode called Nosedive, which is being compared to the social credit system in China. In this episode, every citizen has a rating from 0 to 5, which is based on subjective assessments made by everyone else that you meet using a mobile phone app. The rating has a social function, but it also determines commercial decisions like what type of car you can hire or which neighborhood you can live in. So, and if a person drops to 0, the person will be removed from the platform or removed from the society and will be imprisoned. So we want to show you a small scene from the episode where we meet the main character, Lacey. So you can open the link.
Do we need audio for this?
No, I'll just explain what
Okay. Great.
So the scene is where she is going to. Okay, let's
Hold on, ads.
Yeah, this scene is where she's going to take a flight to her best friend's wedding. It turns out she got too low score and gets told that every plane is full. The only plane available that night is reserved for members of Prime Flight Program, which requires you to have a score of 4.2 or higher to qualify. And Lacey has only 4.18. She then gets frustrated, as you can see, and gets kicked out of the airport by the security guard with a penalty of double damage rating and a -1 decreasing of her score for 24 hours. And after she got kicked out, everyone in the airport also rates her down because of her behavior. So her life is getting turned upside down, really. And this shows how people with lower ratings can't use planes, just like the example of people with lower score in the pilot study in China can't take high-speed trains. So we don't want to spoil too much. This is just a small thing, but we really recommend you to have a look at the episode because it's really interesting. A difference is that this episode, in this episode, the rating is based by everyone else's opinions of your appearance and behavior and how you look on social media. So everyone has to strive to be perfect all the time. While the pilot studies in China is a much more complex system and it's controlled by the government. But we can see some comparings, and yeah, like the other Black Mirror episodes, you see how technology is really not a happy ending story all the time. You see the bad impact technology have. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So then we'll move on to looking at a few examples of propaganda games. Start out with a game called Harpooned. Take a look at that as well. Most of these videos are pretty old, so the resolution is quite low. Apologize for that, but not much you can do. So this is Harpoon. It's a Japanese cetacean research simulator. It was developed by an Australian guy, and he developed it as a critique aimed towards the Japanese government, which are posing they claim that their whaling efforts are scientific in purpose and that they are killing whales and hunting whales for scientific purposes, for research and study. So what this game is essentially a shoot 'em up, a pretty classic style. You have a boat and you shoot whales, and you can see there's sort of satire humor going on here, like says scientific when your score pops up, sort of motivational text. If we move ahead a little bit, let's see. Yeah, here it is. So you're after a while, you get to a sort of checkpoint where you meet this research ship, which takes all the whale meat you have gathered. And yeah, like again with the text, it says loading meat onto research vessel for further study. And then after it has filled up, let's see, a couple of seconds, you will get these little scores up here, which is pet food and whale burgers. And it says researching while filling it up. So yeah, it's really about it. It's a commentary and a critique aimed towards the whaling efforts of the Japanese government. We can then move on to the next example, which is, gotta warn you, a couple of these games are pretty brutal and not very nice to look at, but we think it's important to include them either way. So this is Sog's Nightmare, which stands for Zionist, or SOG stands for Zionist Occupied Government. It is used to, that acronym is used to support the, let's see, let's get the video to play here. It's used to support the conspiracy theory that the world is secretly run by Jews. It is a first-person shooter where you perform ethnic cleansing, essentially, of Jewish people. Let's skip ahead a bit. So you can see there's some Nazi imagery going around there, and there's also Jewish symbols on the trucks. And essentially, the goal of the game is to, murder Jewish people. You can also see right there that they use imagery from World War II with the patches that the Jewish people had to wear as well. And this game was released in 2006 by Matthew Ramsey. He's a former high-ranking member of the National Socialist Movement, and have been downloaded and played thousands of times by February 2008. And to make this game, the creator used a program called, or like a creation engine called the First Person Shooter Creator, which is a tool that advertises that no programming or design knowledge is needed to create a game. So this is like a pretty good example of how easily you can create this sort of propaganda games without any specific knowledge. All right. Moving on to the next example. This is Fugitive Hunter, War on Terror. This is a strange game. It's a pretty short video, but I'll explain quickly. It's a first-person shooter where you are an agent from U.S. government, and you are tasked with hunting down the top 10 most wanted fugitives at the time of the release of the game, anyways, in the U.S. And it has been critiqued for various stereotypical depictions of people, and it actually uses real people. The fugitives are real people, like we'll see in a second here. So this, I believe, is one of the last stages. There's Osama bin Laden, and when you are attempting to capture a fugitive, like this level, you're supposed to capture one of his right-hand men, I believe. Then it turns into a fighting game like this. So that's one of the critiques as well. It takes something that's pretty serious and turns it into something kind of goofy. Yeah. Okay, and the last example in terms of, almost last example in terms of game is America's Army. We'll go more in depth on that as the paper we posted was mostly related to that game. So, but for now, all you need to know, it's a first-person shooter recruitment tool, essentially developed by the U.S. government. But like I said, we'll go more in depth in part 2 on that. So finally, for part 1, we'd like to talk about a game called Devotion, and what we refer to as the Devotion incident. So this game is a first-person psychological horror video game set in Taiwan in 1980s, with the majority of the game happening in a small apartment and the surrounding complex in Taipei. This game was created and developed by Red Candle Games for Steam and also other platforms. It did release on 19th of February 2019, but it was then removed a week later because of a controversy with some art assets that ended up in the game. The game is, like I said, created by a company called Red Candle Games, based in Taiwan, and their games feature a lot of Taiwanese culture and folk religion. So yeah, the particular art asset, or there were multiple art assets actually, but this is one of them, the most famous one from the example. So these, well, for a bit of context, Taiwan and the Republic of China have a pretty tense relationship since the end of World War II, because Taiwan was basically handed over to the Republic of China. They were previously controlled by Japan, and there were, well, many things happened, but one of the major incidents is called the February 28th incident, in which Republic of China massacred tens of thousands of Taiwanese people, as they were attempting a anti-government uprising, and that was in 1949, and basically began a period which is now known as the White Terror, in which many Taiwanese people disappeared or died or were imprisoned for various reasons. So what was basically found in this game is anti-Chinese government propaganda. These 4 characters on the edges of this art asset actually read Xi Jinping, Winnie the Pooh, moron. And as soon as this was found, the developer, or the game was removed from various or all of the platforms it was on. The developers weren't heard from for quite a while, until they resurfaced and apologized for, and they said that art asset was a placeholder that made it into game. No further statements were made, but the game was they got rid of all the art assets that the Chinese government found to be offensive. However, the game is still unavailable. So if you go to their website, you can actually see that it's still on the landing page, and there's a big focus on it. But then we can go to games. Let's see if it loads. There we go. Games. This is Detention, their other game, which is still available. I guess no similar incident occurred with that game. So let's go to the game page, and then the page is still there, which is kind of weird. But and the press kit is also available. But if we go to the trailer, it's been set to private. We can click purchase, which takes us down to the Steam link, but the link is broken and it's no longer available on Steam, and it's no longer available on any of the platforms they released it on. So that's an example where there was found hidden propaganda messages, I suppose, in a game, and it was promptly censored. Right. So that concludes part 1 of our presentation. Are we in need of a break, or should we continue?
If you want to break now, you can press the yes button.
What we could also do, if people are up for it, is maybe do a little bit of discussion on what we have talked about so far, and then continue, take a little break, and then continue with the paper and do a discussion of that afterwards as well.
I think there are 3 people that have indicated the need for a break, specifically for a coffee break, it seems. But I think that may just be the restriction of the icons we have at avail. Probably, I mean, if we, how about a 6-minute break until 55? We can do some discussion and then move on to your paper.
Yeah, sounds good.
Long enough?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, then have a 6-minute silence. Okay, whatever that means.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can move on, maybe.
I think so as well, yeah, probably.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Let's continue the journey and have a look at the specific paper. So part 2, the paper is called Violent Video Games and the Military, Recruitment, Training and Treating Mental Disability by John Derby from 2014. So in this part, we are going to discuss the paper and have a look at more specific serious games that is discussed in this paper as well. So the paper aims to perform a critical examination of the US military, mental disability, and the games America's Army, Full Spectrum Leader, and Full Spectrum Warrior, as well as the virtual Iraq project. And he opens up the paper by asking, did you know that video games are art? And then he continues by discussing the impact of violent video games. So this is just some samples taken from the paper, where he quotes, among other people, Carrie Friedman in a paper from 2003, that most of the controversy has little to do with art, but rather the seductive, addictive allure of video games as interactive media. And he also quotes the curator of the art of video games, who says, explains the unique opportunity games provide, as we are invited by the artist to inject our own morality, our own worldview, our own experiences into the game as we play it. And as he also talks about in the paper, the art of video games was an exhibition by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which was on display from March through September 2012 in the beginning. And the exhibition was designed to highlight the evolution of art within the video game medium over its 40-year history. And yeah, there were over 500,000 people who attended the exhibition. And yeah, he also brings up that some games allow users to simulate such heinous events as stalking and raping women and girls, torture, school shooting sprees, ethnic cleansing, and urinating on corpses. So, many educators and also parents, of course, and others are concerned about such games because of their potential to negatively influence young people. Because younger people are the most likely ones who gets most easily influenced by such games. Yeah, next one. Yeah, so America's Army has been discussed in previous lectures, and as Jacob said, it's developed and published by the US Army in 2002 with the intention of informing, educating, and recruiting potential soldiers. It propagates Army values to potential recruits and to gamers around the world for public relations purposes. So we can have a look at a short video from the game. So this is also a first-person shooter video game. the game consists of 2 stages, because you start with an individual training stage, and this is the second stage where you are in an online multiplayer environment. And the game has been criticized for multiple reasons, like when you get shot or you shoot someone, there's like no blood, you just lay there, and it's really unrealistic, and it paints a very clean picture of war. And it's only focusing on the technical aspects of war and not the moral or ethical aspects. And it's also been criticized for the fact that it has been used in schools and recruitment centers in order to recruit a younger audience who gets easily affected by these games. So yeah, the main problem is that it's really unrealistic, and it paints a very clean picture of war. And it amassed 40 million downloads from 2002 to 2008 in 6 years, and has been more effective for recruiting than any other method, reaching nearly a third of all young people. Yeah, so just think about that, how this game has influenced so many young people. So now Jacob is going to talk about the virtual Iraq project and how the same game structures that are used to recruit young soldiers are recycled for treating mental disabilities that soldiers acquire in combat.
Yes. So, like Julie said, the virtual Iraq project is essentially America's Army reworked into a VR version. It's used as a form of treatment for treating patients with PTSD, mainly caused by combat-related mental disabilities or combat-related situations. And this, we'll have a look at it actually after this ad. Yeah, so essentially it puts you as the patient in a situation which is controlled by a therapist. And they can control things here such as you can see daylight, night vision simulation, and so on. And can put the patient in a multitude of various situations that is supposed to simulate the original situation that caused them to obtain PTSD in the first place. So, for instance, here we can see a convoy driving along a highway, and it's then being attacked by insurgents, and they are shooting at the windows, and the glass breaks. It's supposed to create a very stressful situation. And also you will see your soldiers or your friends, I guess, getting shot and being in distress, and generally, yeah, supposed to create very distressing situations as a form of exposure therapy, which is then supposed to help the patient cope with flashbacks and so on. And the paper, I think it is a pretty interesting quote. That this project ironically demonstrates the problematic marriage between violence and entertainment, characterized by the very real disabling consequences of war, and that the same game structures that are used to recruit young soldiers, that would be America's Army, are then recycled for treating mental disabilities that perhaps those same soldiers acquire in combat because they were recruited by America's Army tool. So it's sort of a, I guess the author is trying to visualize sort of a perpetual state of things there, where you're being recruited, you're being treated by the same tool that recruited you, and you got PTSD as a consequence of being recruited, right? So it's quite interesting. Also, we found another paper which it refers to another study on VR exposure therapy, and we can link that in the in the end as well, if people wants to have a look at that. But actually show that in certain environments, VR exposure therapy can have a better effect on patients than so-called in vivo exposure therapy or real-life exposure therapy. There were a few different reasons for this presented in the paper, but one of the reasons was that the therapist was actually in the same room as the patient while the patient was in VR and interacting with the patient as a person. And they pointed out that in most other studies, the way it's been done is that the patient is in a room with VR, and that the therapist is in a completely different room controlling the entire situation, and that the patient is being communicated with by some type of Siri AI or something in that sense, because they're then being giving feedback. And the disconnect that happens there between the patient and the therapist, where sort of the technology takes over and creates these various types of feedback, like you're doing a good job, like keep at it, whatever. That technological gap that happens there is something that one should be aware of in terms of VR exposure therapy. And they actually in the study found that the patients who had been using VR therapy had a lower relapse rate. So they were going through the experiment and then tested again 6 months later, and most of them were doing better than they had done with in vivo or in real life therapy. Paper also briefly discussed the benefits of VR exposure therapy in the sense that we can create environments and situations in VR that we cannot create in real life, and how this can be interesting to explore in terms of even further treating patients with PTSD and similar mental disabilities. Yes. So now we'd kind of like to open for discussion for this paper. We would just like to present a few of our own points of view, I guess, to begin with. So would you like to start, Julie, or should I?
You can start if you want.
Okay, yeah. So these are some more opinions and our pros and cons, I guess, for this paper. We feel that the paper presents both sides of the matter to some extent, like pro propaganda games or violence in video games, and against. Good example of this, a few slides back, where we have these couple of points here. We get people who are against the violent video games, or people who are afraid that they have a severe impact on people who play them. And we also get opinions from this curator from the Art of Video Games here, and their perspective on video games and how they sort of how we inject our values into the game rather than the game injecting its values into us. We also felt that the paper had sort of a subjective tone, perhaps confirmation bias in looking for reasons that violent video games are bad, and then using these examples specifically to sort of propagate that opinion. In my opinion, I felt like the author had kind of gone in with the idea in his mind, set in stone, that violent video games are bad, and this is how I'm going to show or tell other people that it's bad, to some extent at least. yeah. Anything to add, Julia?
Yeah, yeah, we could also discuss like how the violent video games influences young people. Like, are they getting violent themselves? Like, there's no proof that after you have played a violent video game, you go out and shoot people or, you know. Um, so, yeah, that could be an interesting discussion about violent video games, how they actually impact young people. And like we could also discuss whether video games are art or not. And yeah, we would also like to know people's opinion about these violent video games. How do you feel about America's Army, for example, as a recruitment tool for young people? And how do you feel about the virtual art project as a treatment for PTSD? And yeah.
So yeah, let me chip in. I mean, that sounds very interesting. The paper provides an overview. I share your assessment of the bias there of the paper, because it really just looks at a very critical perspective. But before we get perhaps further into discussion, two questions. Number one, is America's Army still hot in a sense that it's still used, or is it more like a was it interesting in the early 2000s, the time it was created and so on, or is there do we I know there's still continuous developments, but are they actually adopted and still used by the army for recruiting participants? That would be a question, and that leads to my question too. I was surprised looking at the virtual Iraq idea and the treatment of PTSD with such a relatively lo-fi game. That kind of struck me a bit. Wouldn't the technology need to keep track with the realism that is necessary to kind of relive the experiences in the Iraqi setting? Hence my question, right? So if there was a continuous development with the capabilities we have nowadays, which are close to photorealistic, I could imagine that would provide much more potential there. So is there any study or has any paper looked at this particular problem? So it's basically two questions in one, but just wanted to get them out.
Right. So in terms of whether America's Army is still a thing, I guess is the first part of the question. What we found were when we were looking through for gameplay videos, there have been multiple versions, and right now, it seems like there's sort of a live game version. It's not necessarily, they're not dropping new games like America's Army 2002, 2004, and so on, but rather having a version which is continuously updated, I believe, and focuses mainly on the multiplayer aspects. And the graphics seem to have become a lot better than what we've seen, especially with Virtual Iraq. Like it's not up there with games like, say, Red Dead Redemption in terms of visual fidelity, but yeah, it's better than the 2002 version, for sure.
Right, that's a good point.
Add that, yeah, I think America's Army was most hot between 2002 and 2008 in that 6 years. And it was also distributed through recruiting stations, air shows, and sporting events, and video game conventions and video game magazines. So it was widely distributed. But as Jacob said, I think it's more like of online um, a social game rather than a recruitment game. And of course, there has been a lot of new battle games that has taken over for America's Army, I think.
Yeah, it's like I think it'd be, if you look at the average gamer or player, I think they would much rather go for games like Call of Duty or say Fortnite, Apex Legends, Battlefield. Well, Call of Duty and Battlefield specifically when it comes to those type of games, because those are huge franchises and they have a lot of games out and they have had a lot of time to polish their gameplay and all the mechanics and so on. So it's kind of a more appealing package. I think it's more marketed. It's marketed in a different way, and that's sort of yeah. There's no reason for people to check out America's Army when we have all these other games that are doing the same thing, but I would argue better.
Yeah, and especially right now when everyone is sitting home in quarantines, they use it for entertainment only.
Yeah. Because
Yep.
like there's the element of propaganda is still there in the latest versions, right? So would you rather have a game that does the game mechanics better and has more polish, or a slightly worse game but also has propaganda directed towards you? I think that's an aspect to think about as well. Might get annoying at some point, you know.
It depends a bit how. I mean, the best propaganda is probably subtle propaganda, right? So, I mean, you have oftentimes the more explicit one when you think about advertisement and so on. But I think the most successful ones, at least historically, was always the one that was a bit more subtle, you know. So, and I think America's Army, while seemingly providing this at the surface, I mean, the selling point is to have an entertainable, free first-person shooter, which with I guess multiplayer functionality, so as to keep it highly attractive. But also, what an interesting mechanic they have built in there, or the interesting mechanic. I don't recall now if we discussed it before, but this was this swapping paradigm, right? So that's really a very unique features, which I, at least I'm not aware of any other a game that uses it. If you think about Counter-Strike and so on, right, you always pick one side, right, the good ones or bad ones and so on, and that is really a clear delineation. But here it basically means you're always playing the army, whatever you want to do, right? So whatever direction you take, and that's a very subtle way of entrenching that. You know, you first of all playing on the good side. But also thinking always from the perspective of the well, the army, I guess, in whatever abstract sense. I haven't played the game, so I can't really account for this fully. But I would imagine that if you look at the same uniform at all times, basically always from an army perspective, it kind of entrenches subtly that there is desirability attached to it, right? So it gives it a bit more positive twist, I guess. So it's a very interesting idea. Yeah. So the paper, I mean, we haven't heard any other comments at this stage, but the paper is an interesting overview over the kind of history, availability, and contrast of different approaches, be it in the kind of a popular culture to some extent, or in the art in particular, with respect to those games. But of course, it has one of the shortcomings is that it doesn't really provide any strong attack point for evaluation, right? So it doesn't give you the numbers, if you like, that allow us to scrutinize in both directions, both to support suggesting, oh yeah, that they actually make a sensible claim here, as opposed to falsifying it on the other side. So it's a bit more like an opinion piece, if you like. You know, so that kind of highlights the author's position with respect to that game. As you pointed out yourself already, there's a considerable bias in there, but that's not surprising. If you write this way, you kind of need to pitch your storyline, your angle. And it's clear that the author, of course, maintains that position, it seems, and that being a critical one. So from a discussion point of view, perhaps good for you guys with respect to the report and paper, it would perhaps be interesting to see if you find a counter argument, that is a paper that actually takes the opposite position, right, or
Yeah.
of similar nature, also bit opinion piece, but like popular sciencey direction. So yeah, similar like this outlet, and see if you find anything that is advocates, for example, for America's Army, or perhaps even advocates from a PTSD perspective. So meaning arguing, okay, even though the game has its bad sides, because of its opportunity and the free potential to treat traumatic experiences, the net benefit is still positive. That could also be an argument I could imagine that people would entertain. So see if you find something in this direction. Then you have a nice discussion basis, right, for bouncing back. Right now,
Yep.
you always need to balance this bias at all times, which is easy to simply follow, but it's very hard to contrast and criticize simply, right? But if you have another artifact, meaning another output that conflicts with it, contrasts it, then it's a lot easier to navigate between those two perspectives, right? So.
But Christopher,
Yep.
I was actually reading the paper a bit differently.
Okay.
If you look at the author, so the author is a professor in visual art education. And okay, we have to buy into this, that this is art, but he's pointing to the Supreme Court ruling that video games are considered art. Now, so what I'm reading from this paper is that he's trying to set the stage for how should art students discuss video games in a critical way. So I don't think he's trying to say that violent games and prove that violent games affect. He's saying that there might be links here, and as art students you need to be critical about the link between the military and the entertainment industry. And so he has the curricular consideration. He has several other possible interesting discussions that he's urging his students to. So I think he's not taking a strong position as you're suggesting. I think he's more saying that art students should be critical, should be able to go into this with a critical mindset and trying to analyze links and analyze beyond just the artistic kind of the visual aspects only.
Yeah. I see your point, but so.
But obviously there's a bias, and he doesn't provide. But I don't think it was his purpose to try to include whether the violent games.
No.
But obviously he's pointing out some dilemmas, saying that okay, now if it didn't have an influence, now why could you have a successful use for it in the treatment of post-traumatic stress? So I think he's more like a professor, like enjoying setting up some interesting questions for his students to critically go more in depth on analyzing than claiming that that he found the kind of the proven position or the proven impact of the games used for this purpose.
Right. Yeah, I follow you. This delineation is quite clear. What strikes me to this comment is the discussion there that the Department of Defense actually sponsored what was it called? Institute of Creative Technologies at the University of Southern California to explore the integration of those aspects. And what is interesting there, if you get funded as a university to pursue this kind of research in this direction, how will it sway your position, right, and the positioning of your output? And this, I think, could lend for a nice contrast in a way that, how is the to some extent like a meta perspective, and how far is propaganda embedded in the papers themselves, right? If you like to read this way. So that's what struck me to look at it. But I agree, it's mostly about structuring and separating the different perspectives.
So I think it's definitely worth, as you suggest, going more in depth and finding papers that more clearly try to conclude, trying to say, okay, what is the evidence here? What do we know? And does it really impact or does it not? And under what circumstances would it have an impact on young or anyone in a disadvantaged position or whatever?
That's
but
a
I
point.
think another interesting thing, I didn't raise that issue just after the break, but it's another interesting issue I think is cultural biases versus propaganda. because we all have biases, and if we are to make a war game and we need to choose an enemy, it could be the Russians, it could be the Islamists, it could be the Jews. Would that necessarily be a propaganda game? I mean, it obviously plays on biases and obviously is passing on some cultural interpretation that may not be acceptable or may not be the one you would like to see in a society. But would it be propaganda just because the enemy happens to be one of those minorities, if you want?
Mm. Yeah, but I think
So the Zog, for instance, I don't know the Zog, but it seemed to me that it could just be the designers wanting to have a different type of enemy and not necessarily have a very clear propaganda. And to me, I think if it's a propaganda game, it's a very clear. The authors or the creators have a very clear agenda in trying to have an impact. And I'm not so sure that even though there are cultural biases, they necessarily are going to be propaganda games.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, for
although they will continue to strengthen the bias. So you could say it's kind of implicit, but again, the question is whether this is how we should define propaganda games.
I think Björna has or Vega also there. I think you can just chip in random order, given that there's so limited contribution that you could just speak up, I believe.
Okay, just a quick note on the funding of papers. I've seen some videos talking about funding of Hollywood media, so movies, where military or American military will provide assistance to discuss firstly the plot of movies where they want to include the military. So as you said, when you include or have funding from military, you will have a certain bias no matter how you do it, because they will most likely also have this routine of going through to approve the material or have it adjusted to alter their point of view.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Exactly. So looking at the funder and the relationship, I mean, that's I agree with you. That's why what it struck me as really scary. And this military-industrial complex and military educational academic complex in the US is quite well known to be reasonably well integrated. So selectively, but if so, then well integrated. So it's worthwhile to figure out how far this could, draw biases, right? So good point. Vega, you had something you wanted to contribute, I believe.
I had, but I kind of lost my train of thought, so it's fine.
Fair enough. So just for the delineation, you recall that Tomasz and Kai talked about violence in video games, right? In the previous one of the previous sessions, and I think it would be important to be really clear. It would be important to be really clear and delineate what you are doing, what they are doing. So their problem was really to ask the question, or the challenge was to look at psychological effects. And we're particularly interested: do video games stimulate, aggression and so on, or vice versa? Basically, this kind of reinforcing factor or the igniting role of video games for committing violence. But I think here the question is more general, in a sense that, or at least I believe so, that's open up for discussion there a bit, that the question is, in how far does propaganda have influence, right? Does it change your thinking about the army? That's kind of perspective. Not necessarily are you becoming killer because of it, right? So it plays on a slightly different level from a cognitive perspective, in that it develops and shapes new biases, but it's not necessarily linked to immediate actions. Just more like a perspective challenge there. And I think that's important to bear in mind where the differences lie here, that propaganda as most likely, you know, something that reinforces your perspective, but not necessarily immediately associated with actions, and not necessarily immediately associated with killing. If you think about this whale example, I don't recall the game right now. I mean, there was of course the mechanic was again shooting, of course. Sorry for that, but nevertheless, it was it was really more engage, about entrenching or clarifying the biases that respective parties have. And I think it's important for you to highlight this as part of your discussion point. So not necessarily to fall into the first-person shooter perspective only. I think Blue has some injection, and the question is there, do you consider these games serious games? Her mic is not working, so that's why I'm relaying it here. Serious games as in, are you referring to America's Army Blue, or which games in particular, or all of them? Or? Well, wait this. So Vega. All right, if anyone sees the chat, maybe worthwhile opening the chat, have a look there. So Vega responded and said they have other goals than entertainment. So I guess, so the goal is to sway and disinform. Yeah, so anyway.
So Blue just added that she was just meaning propaganda game category in general.
Okay, yeah.
So
Well, I think is this a serious games discussion is going to be hard to sort of get a conclusion for. As for Harpooned, it doesn't have a very serious tone, and it uses humor as a tool to get a point across. But it's still very much the sole purpose was to create awareness and critique the Japanese government and their whaling efforts. So while the serious games line might be very blurry, I think it could probably count as that.
very another interesting question, Christopher, is so you said that would this be useful as a treatment? Wouldn't you need a better resolution, better quality graphics, whatever you want? And that's I think also is interesting, because I mean in one respect, if you think about athletes, they do visualization. And you could think of VR as very strong visualization. So it's external, so you can't just make up your pictures in your own mind, but you kind of activate more of your senses than just your imagination, if that's the sense. But I was thinking, if you think about other panic disorders, or if you're afraid of spiders, for instance, in the beginning, just thinking about the spider may freak you out. Then during the treatment, then seeing a picture far away is freaking you out. Then touching the picture is freaking you out. Then seeing a dead is freaking you out. I mean, you gradually move up the granularity level. And wouldn't you think the same thing here for VR? I mean, if you have very strong PTSDs, then maybe a very coarse granular would work fine. And then as you move on, you will be closer and closer to reality, because that's how you desensitize. Just thinking that this is not my field. This is more health, I guess, games for health. But I just seem to think that is kind of, if you have a really strong panic disorder or PTSD, then maybe the coarse granularity is more than enough to trigger the responses that you start there, and then gradually you increase the resolution and the quality and the kind of reality, or yeah, into it. Just thinking.
Interesting point. If you've yeah. So you say in granular increments in realism, right? So necessarily then they need to have a more recent version of America's Army for more advanced cases or more advanced treatments. I guess. Oh, if that was the case. Good point. Good point. I don't know. Yeah. Don't know.
There are some raising hands here.
Please, guys. whoever is faster. I don't know who was first, really. That's a bit of a downside. It would be nice to have a bit of a priority list here to see who is there. But since Nakul hasn't said anything or hasn't had a chance to say anything yet, just go for it. First.
I agree to point that just Runa made, but also I would like to add that there could be many different situations that could have caused this particular disorder, PTSD, and a game which is showing only few of them, or maybe even all of them, in if there is something like that, it would be an interesting thing to see if there was one character which is telling the viewer or player uh, to how to act, or what should they do to channel their thoughts. Because for example, another view of looking at this could be uh, the player, in our case the person who is suffering from this particular disorder, has already known the situation. Now it may be uh, helpful or may not be helpful to make him or her go through the same chain of events, but what he should do or she should do should also be shown throughout some medium, and then maybe it could be more effective. And yeah, so that was my one comment. Another comment was more of a question, but maybe I can talk about that at later point in time.
Could just ask now if you would like to.
Sorry?
I could just go ahead with the second one if you would like to.
Okay.
Yep. Unless you
If
have
you
something
guys
else,
have heard about Wolfenstein game,
Mhm.
Wolfenstein 3D, it is based on spy, Allied spy. It's a World War II game, and it is based on the story of a spy, William B.J. Blazkowicz. So my question is that, do we consider this kind of plot of the game to be a propaganda game, because it is based on real real world event, and it assumes certain role, and since it's a war, people who are assuming themselves in that position may think of it as a propaganda game, or maybe have some indirect influence on the player. The game shows really some of the graphics which are related to Nazi army and so on and so forth.
I don't believe BJ Blazkowicz is actually a real person. He is just a protagonist of the Wolfenstein franchise.
Hmm.
So he's fictional. But yeah, there's been a lot of interesting discussions around Wolfenstein, and when the last one came out, or if it was the one before. But there were a lot of discussions regarding the Nazi imagery and how a lot of, well, I guess neo-Nazis were offended by especially the game's tagline, which was "It's time to kill Nazis" or something like that. Yeah, there has been some discussion around that as well. But at the same time, Wolfenstein is a really old franchise. It's sort of a very famous old PC game, the first one, and it's the developers' response to this discussion was that Wolfenstein has always been about killing Nazis, and they didn't know that killing Nazis would be a bad thing. That was essentially their discussion. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Björnar, you had the.
Yep. So I really lost my train of thought. Okay. So about whenever these or the propaganda games can be considered serious games. It seems to be quite challenging to Sorry. It seems to be quite challenging to actually describe whenever a game is a serious game or not, in the same way that the training simulator is a simulator or not. But maybe what we can consider look at them is what the various industries call them. For instance, in this setting, the military will call them a propaganda game, while the researchers will call it serious games or a subclass of serious games. While again, if you look at training simulations, the builder will most likely call it a training simulation and not a serious game. But the researchers will describe the same game or training simulator as a serious game and not as a training simulator. So it's about different words or different meanings.
Interesting challenge. Good point, actually. So you're thinking by just tagging it accordingly, you kind of reframe the game's purpose entirely.
Well, I mean, any game can be used for training if you can single out what you want to train for. Like, for instance, StarCraft is, for the most part, about resource management. And like any strategies can have usage of doing that. But same with chess, it's about resource management and managing where you want to, or which resources you want to put out first. So, yeah, I think it's about the what you want to make it, or want to make out of it.
Interesting point. Yeah. Any other views on this? Perhaps by someone who hasn't contributed yet? No? I think I hear Wolfenstein in the background. No, I'm just mucking around. Yeah, Ole?
I'd like to comment on Bjørnar's comment, because I feel like although his example, StarCraft and chess, gives you training within resource management and positional strategy, it needs to be, or well, I would say it needs to be able to transfer from let's say chess into the battlefield or into football or other sorts of games that needs positional strategy. And I wouldn't say that, well, at least not for chess, that it brings a lot of. It doesn't give you the strategical overlook in the same way that other. I would say that it needs to have some sort of transfer to be able to call it a serious game. You can't just or well, a game for learning. You need to be able to transfer it onto something else. I won't say that neither StarCraft nor chess is actually something that you can bring onto other games or to other fields.
So you're spot on. What's the proper term for this, or what's the term related to this that we're gonna ask you in the exam for? Björn, do you have? No. You have something to say?
I'm not sure I can answer your
All right.
question.
No, my
because
point. I want to get it, and perhaps I hope I get it right here. From what I understand, I fundamentally agree with Ole that of course you need to see have this transfer, right? If you see chess is chess and not as a generic way of solving the strategy, then that is of course a bit problematic. But I think the point here you're looking at is alignment, right? So the idea and how far can you facilitate behavioral change? You know, that having this transfer in other domains based on mechanisms that are specific to serious games, not just games in general. But I'm not sure if that clarifies the point a bit. If not, I'm happy to discuss this further. But other than that, I would just hand over to Björna.
Okay, so quick comment to Ola. I agree, but I'm also thinking that any game have a degree of usefulness, and maybe that's what I didn't clarify or didn't consider, which you're pointed out in that yes, chess is not a very good or might not be very good for a specific scenario. But if we take a look back at and look at training and maybe just physical training for instance, the military, they want you to run around and sort of run laps to build physical strength. But running for a long distance on a flat surface is not something you most likely will do in a combat scenario. So what they do is they try to look at specific events that happened in a combat scenario and try to recreate that to, as Christopher said, it improve the or increase the learning outcome. And yeah, that's where my train of thought was lost.
Yeah. Cool. Anyone else feels like responding to it? Because that's a bit much of a discussion that's really at the core of serious games more generally. I mean, beyond just propaganda, but you know, coming back to the idea, okay, what is a serious game? What does not constitute a serious game? And I hope that by the end of this course will ironically arrive at a consensus to some extent to see what a serious games can be, what not. Of course, the most challenging aspect seems to be really that the boundaries are very, very blurry, right? So it's really the framing, and it may not even be the game that you're playing at all, but literally the situation in which you are asking someone to play it, right? If I play a strategy game in a classroom setting, I would imagine that you have a quite a bit of different learning outcome, especially if you bring it back to the classroom setting and suggest to the students that they just played a resource management game, if you like, or strategy game, or the like, and then bring it back to an economic context or to a leadership discussion or whatever else. So it has a quite different immediate impact. So the question is, in how far is the game itself the full package of this serious game, or is it just a tool, a component out of the richer toolbox that includes discussion and so on, that is necessary to frame a serious game, right? So perhaps that's also an insight that one could gain from this as well.
Following up on that, Christopher, I know that Simon used to point to the Olympics as a serious game. Did we take that perspective so far in this course? No.
I don't think so.
No, because his point is that if you look at the Olympic Charter, you find that the point of the fundamental principles of Olympism, the second item there is the goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind with a view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. So it's not about winners. I mean, that's what they say. It's not about winners. It's not about medals. It's not about the commercial aspect, but it's about the society and the development of society and a peaceful society and human dignity. So it's in Simon's perspective, the Olympics is a serious game because it has a different purpose than just entertainment.
Very good point, actually. Yeah, very good point. Another example of framing, I believe. Yes. Anyone else? Am I overseeing fingers or raised hands or whatever the proper syntax for that would be? I don't see anything in the chat here. Anyone concerned? Okay. Well, thank you very much for now. I think, Runa, do you have any more thoughts you want to share?
No, I think covered everything I had in mind.
Yeah, good. Let me just share some other thoughts, not so much thoughts on the paper right now, but I had gotten in inquiries before and had committed to providing some layout or some structure as to how you would go about developing your reports for the end of this term for this paper here, this course in particular. And I've put those on the wiki. I believe I called this page paper formats. I'm happy to receive comments on this, questions on this and the like in the form of issues, ideally, so I can discuss them in an open forum. But if it's, of course, more private question, that can also be by email, of course. I called it paper structure. It's also now linked from the main wiki. And here we differentiate between two structures. One of them is more like the overview paper. That is for people that survey and discuss an area more comprehensively and want to present it. And the other one is the kind of development paper. That would be a case where individuals actually have gone, or at least I know of one group that planned to do so, went about actually developing a game, conceptualizing, perhaps even implementing a prototype, but either way, conceptualizing it and provide a structure of how that would be done in this particular context. So you can have a look at this and read through it and so on. This is just provided or template structures in a way. They're by no means prescriptive in a sense that you need to strictly follow those, but it's just to give you a bit of guidance in case you are lost as to how such a paper would look like. And as I mentioned before, if you have questions, comments, or want further contextualization, clarification, just create an issue, and that would be good. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments? No, doesn't seem so. So in any case, thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I think, again, as I mentioned before, you did a really good job in kind of framing the propaganda theme more general, in a more general sense, and then digging down and getting it, down to a level that is serious games consumable, and leading over to the discussion of, a particular perspective of propaganda and how it's perceived, perhaps from art perspective, and so on. So it was a very interesting approach you took there. So I would encourage others to also pay attention to this, particularly the first part. The presentation part was quite nicely driven narrative. So you took us on a journey, so to say. So thank you very much for this indeed. Next week, I believe, following propaganda, we hear about student performance, if that's correct. And that's by Alexander and by Ole. Right? I like this forum here because there's literally no feedback, meaning I don't like this forum here because there's literally no feedback. So that's sometimes a bit tricky. But anyway, I hope that is still happening. So please get in touch so we can discuss the paper. I hear that there's virtual clapping by Vega, Runo, and the like, and I think there were enough reasons to cite them in congratulation to your talk, because you did a good job there. So thank you very much for your presentation, Jakob and Julie. Julie, yeah. Yeah, looking forward to actually also see your report. Cool. Yeah, thank you.
For the attention and good discussion. Many interesting points.
Indeed, you're right.
Very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Cool. Well, I guess then we close the meeting. So see you next week, I think, in most cases, and have a good week.
Thank you. Likewise.